Welcome home, brave heroes. I'm Ash. This is HeroQuest, and there wasn't actually supposed to be a BWODECAST this Monday, but by request, I was asked to look at a couple of sources and provide a reaction, provide an opinion. So, settle in. You already know from the title of the video, from the beautiful thumbnail art, what the subject is going to be, what the topic is. This is going to be a graphically, minimally invasive video. We're just going to be putting basically the screen that I am recording up. So if you'd like to see some stuff context adjacent, I'm going to be trying to explain everything as best as I can in context, because that's kind of the point of things here for this topic. We're going to be looking at a couple of things and talking about a couple of things to answer the question that seems to be popping up a lot since the Avalon Hill remake, but I suppose it's probably always been asked. Is the world of HeroQuest the world of Warhammer? And you please excuse my phrasing of the question. I think it's a fine question. In the video title, I've poked a little bit of fun at it, but I do think it's a fine question. I think it's a fun question. I think that it's a valid question. I think all people really want to do is kind of be certain of what lines might exist so that they know whether or not they can cross them without other fans of the same thing offering any sort of judgment or ridicule, things like that. If I say, yeah, I definitely want to play an aura in HeroQuest, I don't need anybody raising their eyebrows at me. All I have to do is know ahead of time that aura are not canon in the world of HeroQuest. They're not mentioned anywhere. There are no dragon people, no lizard people, as I like to call them, because aura are much more lizard-like than dragon-like. Just my opinion. So to answer this question, community member Seek Hashem, thanks once again, Seek, for the support and the engagement, has given me a couple of links, a couple of YouTube videos, which I still haven't watched yet. I figured it would be best if I kind of approached this with the take that I have and applied the take that I have to the first source he asked me to look at, which is a forum on the Old Inn, which is, of course, the HeroQuest forums. It's been long-standing. It's been up for a long time. Somebody actually asked, or rather, they ran a poll not too long ago at all this year. Is the world of HeroQuest the world of Warhammer? I imagine if this poll was ran 5 years ago, results might be a little different. Maybe just because of the fan base at the time, because we've got a lot of new fans now. I wouldn't say like we have a huge insurgence of people, but I think that we have potentially just tons of new fans, people who weren't able to play the classic HeroQuest, who found it inaccessible, people from other territories who it didn't get translated into their language, things like that. Now they're able to just go to the store and buy it. And so we have the potential for a lot of new voices, right? And of course, somebody is going to see that this is linked to the old HeroQuest, that it's a remake. And they're going to see Games Workshop's attachment to the IP back then. And they're going to see Milton Bradley. And they're going to dig in, if they didn't already know, and they're going to see Advanced HeroQuest. And they're going to see HeroQuest Advanced Quest. And they're going to see all of these expansions, some of which were exclusive to specific territories. They're going to see the awesome Japanese version of HeroQuest. And just this whole back-end world full of not like official lore, but like community lore. Just there's so many different things. There's so many different interpretations and releases. And that in and of itself is like fascinating. You can write a book about just that. And if you want a more entertaining equivalent, well, I mean, a book might be really cool, especially a well-illustrated one. But if you'd like kind of like the equivalent of what I'm talking about, if you want to experience that right now, and you haven't already watched Jordan Sorcery's fantastic HeroQuest video, you should do that, because the watch is about the game and about the background stuff, and it is one of the most entertaining videos on HeroQuest, period. But I wanted to take a look at this poll, and knowing, or at least firmly asserting, I am that this is kind of a product of its time in which it was posted. If this poll is brought up again in a few years, or if it was brought up a few years ago, I think the results would be a bit skewed. I don't know that they would still be that they would be so different that the results would outright point to a different answer as the majority. I just think that they would be slightly different. Is the world of HeroQuest the world of Warhammer? This was a poll on the old inn, and the answers given that people were able to choose from and vote upon, as one does in a poll, included these 7 options, which I will read verbatim. 1, yes, they are one and the same. 2, yes, they are essentially the same, but we mustn't feel obliged to adopt everything from Warhammer to HeroQuest. 3, depends. They once have been the same, but since the world of Warhammer has been developed further into a different direction since the days of HeroQuest, they are by now 2 different worlds. 4, no, the guys from Greed Workshop wanted it to be, but this was not the intention of MB who owned the game. 5, no, they are 2 different worlds, and that's that. Any similarities are due to the fact that the same people created the backgrounds and reused some ideas. 6, I use a homemade world background anyways. And 7, none of the above. So usually when it comes to polls like this, I'm always like, well, the questions were construed a certain way. They could have had other answers. But this one did include a none of the above option. And the none of the above option actually has 0 votes. So nobody who took this poll actually had any variation of an answer other than what's here, or else they just didn't vote, which is also a thing. I like the 6th entry. I use a homemade world background anyways. There were 2 votes there, 3% of the voters, which, by the way, this wasn't a very big poll. There were only 65 votes, and there are thousands of members on the inn, so it must have been a conversation that's happened many times. So I use a homemade world background anyways. This doesn't answer the question at all. It should have been lumped under none of the above. But is the world of HeroQuest the world of Warhammer? So here's what's interesting to me. There are 4 rather large answers, and there are a couple of really small ones, like super small. There was only 1 vote to no, the guys from Greed Workshop wanted it to be, but this was not the intention of Milton Bradley, who owned the game. And the top 4 answers are, yes, they are one and the same, with 12 votes, sitting at 18%. Yes, they are essentially the same, but we mustn't feel obliged to adopt everything from Warhammer to HeroQuest, which is the largest of them all, with 19 votes, 29%. Depends. They once have been the same, but since the world of Warhammer has been developed further into a different direction since the days of HeroQuest, they are by now 2 different worlds. That has 17 votes. And I feel like that's a valid take, but I feel like it doesn't address the spirit of the question. I'm interpreting the question to be kind of retroactive. But let's look at the 4th answer. No, they are 2 different worlds, and that's that. Any similarities are due to the fact that the same people created the backgrounds and reused some ideas. This is sitting with 14 votes, 22%. That's not a landslide. All 4 of these, there's not a landslide between them. The biggest one is, yes, they are essentially the same, but we mustn't feel obliged. And the second biggest is, depends. They once were, but since Warhammer's been changed, they are now 2 different worlds. So that does kind of give you a little bit of, if you step back and view this kind of more as a whole, it does seem more like a landslide, because there are way more people who, in some form or another, do say, yes, they are one and the same. But 14 votes that say that they're not. So let's analyze why this is. And I'll give you my take on it as well. But first, I want to, with respect to the poster B_0, who had the very first post, or whose post is at the top anyway, in this forum. And I don't want to read every single post in this thread, but I will I will quote pieces from these posts. And I'm going to try my best not to have anybody taken out of context whatsoever, because that's a thing that can happen when you quote things just in pieces. But B_0, B0, posted September 13th of this year. It's not that long ago at all. The Advanced HeroQuest rulebook indicates that HeroQuest is in the Warhammer world. To avoid anachronism, HeroQuest refers to classic HeroQuest, not the modern remake. So we've got, and this is what C. Caution wanted me to react to kind of directly. And I gave my opinion very quickly after seeing what his take was, and I'm going to stand by that, but I will read this before I talk about what that opinion is. Advanced HeroQuest. This is page 3 in the Advanced HeroQuest rulebook. Advanced HeroQuest is set in the Warhammer world, a land of grim fantasy and perilous adventure. On page 45, the same characters that exist in HeroQuest continue their existence in the Warhammer world. So here's an excerpt from the rulebook once more, this time page 45. The heading of this section says HeroQuest characters, and the text says, if you've played all the HeroQuest adventures, you can continue your explorations with the same characters in Advanced HeroQuest. Now, the next bit of commentary that our BO poster has is their existence in the Warhammer world is not an alternate reality, but a continuation. They are, in fact, the same characters. Notice that further down on page 45, even their belongings continue to exist in the Warhammer world. And I'm explaining everything piecemeal because those of you who are listening on the way to work or dropping the kids off at school or cooking or whatever it is that you like to do where you listen only, I super appreciate you guys. I just want to make sure that you know what it is I'm reading here, what I'm looking at. But if you're looking at the screen, then you can kind of see this stuff even before I'm saying it, because I got the screen focused on this post on the forum. But on page 45 of the rulebook, even their belongings continue to exist in the Warhammer world. And the excerpt from the rulebook, page 45, says, we've provided filled-in character sheets for the 4 heroes, though you'll need to write in any quest treasures or magic items that you found in HeroQuest. And next, our poster says, by misunderstanding the following quote from page 3, one might attempt to argue that a doorway was opened between 2 different worlds, which allowed the same HeroQuest heroes to enter the Warhammer world without the 2 worlds being the same. And so the screenshot of this quote from page 3 will explain that. And it says, Advanced HeroQuest opens a new doorway onto the Warhammer world, a doorway to ancient halls and winding tunnels, teeming. And I imagine it goes on to say teeming with monsters, teeming with danger. I don't know. My Warhammer, my Warhammer Light, my Warhammer HeroQuest, Advanced HeroQuest is behind me on a shelf, and the rulebook is safely tucked within. But the poster says, however, that could mean that this doorway merely leads to more facets of the same world, an expansion and advancement in that world. And then our poster says, consider, on page 46, that you can play original HeroQuest adventures with Advanced HeroQuest rules. And the screenshotted image of page 46, the piece of it, says, of course, the header text says HeroQuest Revisited, and the text says you can play any of the HeroQuest adventures using the Advanced HeroQuest rules. Replace the HeroQuest rules for movement, and then it goes on to say more, but it's cropped at this point. Our poster closes by saying, one of those Advanced HeroQuest rules is that it is within the Warhammer world according to page 3 of the Advanced HeroQuest rulebook. This brings all of the original HeroQuest adventures within the Warhammer world, and since those adventures happened temporally prior to any door being opened, their existence in the Warhammer world is temporally prior to any doors being opened. So HeroQuest temporally was always Warhammer. That is, unless those adventures were already within the Warhammer world logically prior to any doors being opened. But in that case, it was also always Warhammer. According to the Advanced HeroQuest rulebook, if there were 2 different worlds at some point, HeroQuest with all of its past history of adventure has been absorbed into the Warhammer world and is no longer distinct. That is, if it was ever distinct. All right, so some of the other posts made here, and this is taken without permission, so with respect to these posters, I hope that you don't mind me taking a look at your quotes and sharing them in this video. The threads are public. I don't even think it's kept my logged in information, so it's available to see for guests, so I really hope that it's okay with you guys. A response topic by Bareheaded Warrior, who says, my vote would be that they are parallel worlds. Obviously, there's a shared heritage, not surprising, due to Games Workshop's heavy involvement in the early days and the desire to share miniature sculpts for cost reasons. But even then, recollections of some of those involved at the time made it clear that this wasn't a clean-cut definitive statement of HeroQuest is set in the Warhammer world, and the world map referred to in early posts was on the later expansion pack and not in the original game, so it feels like positions may have been varied. Dave Morris wrote, and Dave Morris is a seminal piece of the origin of HeroQuest, and is being quoted here in this post by Bareheaded Warrior. I don't recall there being a HeroQuest world at the time I wrote the first book, referring to the first HeroQuest book he wrote. He wrote a series of choose-your-own-adventure style HeroQuest novels. That's the context. So I created part of one and drew my own map of it. By the time I was asked to write the second book, Games Workshop had designed their own version of the world, which included some of the place names from my novella, but with a quite different geography, loosely based on the Warhammer world, as it said on the front. I just mentioned that because if you refer to the map from the second book while reading the first, you will see that the route the characters take makes no sense. One view at the time was, well, it's for 10-year-olds. But I can tell you that when I was 10, that sort of thing would have annoyed the hell out of me. And our poster goes on to say the full text with links and maps is available on his Fabled Lands website. And then we have another quote, again, the full text with links and maps being available on the Fabled Lands website, which is Dave Morris's current contemporary choose-your-own-adventure style work. And it's a brilliant work. It is a beautiful series of books, just speaking from personal experience. But our quote from Dave Morris once more is, by the time I was working on the second book, Games Workshop had dashed in and changed my map of the HeroQuest world to something more like their Warhammer map. It wasn't actually the same as the Warhammer one, but it had a lot of place names in common, including the curious Trollheim. Did they know what a troll actually was? And also made no sense in relation to the events of the first book, The Fellowship of Four. Go figure. Anyway, if you saw my sketch map of the original HeroQuest world, here's the detailed version I did while writing Fellowship. And then there would be our place where the actual map would be, which is not included in the quote in the post. But then he goes on to say, Dave Morris, that is, when I got to the third HeroQuest book, The Tyrant's Tomb, which is this year's Christmas freebie, I knew to ladle on the chaos references, objectionable though it was to have go along with the lazy chaos as evil theme of the War Quest, or do I mean Hero Hammer, series, when I knew that in Mike Moorcock's original concept, it was all so much richer, stranger, and genuinely nastier. Bareheaded Warrior goes on to say in his post, even from those partially shared beginnings, the two worlds didn't evolve in parallel. No updates that were applied to Warhammer worlds subsequently were ever backported into HeroQuest, and no attempt was made to iron out any differences or contradictions, which suggests that the intent wasn't for the two worlds to be one, just to have some common ground. Obviously, we are all free to use and abuse the Warhammer, Morris, and current official versions as we see fit, but personally, I quite like the draft feel to Morris's maps, as I feel that probably feels closer to the vague idea of geography and cartography that were perhaps around in such days, and I don't see that the HeroQuest world needs to be rigorously defined. A woolly setting is sufficient as a backdrop to quests so time permitting. I might take the one advantage of the HQ 2021 reprint of liberating us from chaos, and try to merge the world changes with Morris's maps and add that world detail into my own HeroQuest Gold rulebook possibly. So there are a ton of other quotes and posts in this. I'm going to read Hispazargon's really quick. Skipping right by Kurgan's. I don't necessarily mean to. Kurgan, giving a thanks on the Morris quotes. But then Hispazargon, how he sees this: all European releases of Classic HeroQuest and Advanced HeroQuest are part of the 80s world of Warhammer. American Classic Game System, KK, and Rotwell releases, Return of the Rich Lord, sometimes I like to just say it, just to save time, are also part of the 80s world of Warhammer because they basically the same stories and characters as the one from their European similar boxes. American Classic Frozen Horror and Mage of the Mirror expansions are not necessarily part of the 80s world of Warhammer, but they could be easily inserted into it if you want to. HeroQuest is not part of mid-90s world of Warhammer because Games Workshop introduced a lot of changes in their old world story, excuse me. However, with some fixes like assuming the Famirs exist in the world of Warhammer, and the HeroQuest main story happened during an ancient era of the later Warhammer, like the Emperor Karl Franz years, maybe HeroQuest could be considered part of such past without many serious problems. And of course, 2021 Remix HeroQuest is not part of the world of Warhammer anymore. Then we have a post from BO responding to Hispazargon. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It's by Bareheaded Warrior. It's by Bareheaded Warrior responding to BO. Excuse me. And this responds to the original post, the first post that I read. Whilst you make some good points, I think you are missing a key aspect. AHQ, Advanced HeroQuest, is not HQ, HeroQuest. It was published later than the game system exclusively by Games Workshop, so the fact that text within AHQ clearly paces HQ within the Warhammer world just demonstrates that was Games Workshop's desire and position at that point in time. If you consider the development of HeroQuest itself, then you can see that with time, the Games Workshop influence on the flavor and setting increases with time. The Warhammer HQ map on Rotwell is rightly raised as significant in this discussion, but for me the significance is that the map didn't appear in the game system rulebook, quest book, or KK quest book. If you consider the men-at-arms in Wizards of Morcar, for example, their appearance and armament, those are obviously more congruent with Warhammer Fantasy Battle than with original HeroQuest, which didn't feature halberds or great swords at all, and depicts helmets with horns rather than plumes. Hispazargon, he goes on to say, you are entirely correct in stating that many, but not all, of the inconsistencies between HQ and Warhammer disappear if we consider HQ to be set in an earlier version of the Warhammer world. And whilst that may be a useful workaround, I don't think that was deliberate. The reasons why HQ fits better in a hypothetical early world for Warhammer is that such a world would presumably be free of much of the Games Workshop and Warhammer proprietary changes, their IP in fact, and would instead be a more generic fantasy world, and it is that more generic fantasy world that the original concept of HeroQuest was set in. If you consider particularly the original HeroQuest game system then, as Avalon Hill discovered and demonstrated, you don't need to alter very much at all to strip out the Warhammer world proprietary changes. Replace Famir with trolls, and we are back in a generic Tolkien-inspired world, Chaos with Dread, and change a few place names and you are sorted. The Games Workshop and Warhammer construct of Chaos as evil doesn't really work, as they borrowed the concept of Chaos from Moorcroft, where it wasn't Chaos as evil. It was far more intricate and subtle, so replacing this with Dread as evil actually works better. AH actually went further than needed by replacing the Emperor and Empire references with King and Realm, but I'm pretty sure we had Empires and Emperors long before we had Games Workshop. So there's more discussion on this, and it's all really interesting and good discussion. There's lots of good points being made, but without even having to do any work and say anything, Bareheaded Warrior nailed exactly how I feel about the entire debacle. I halfway agree with Hispazargon's take, but I absolutely am on board with Bareheaded Warrior's take. Advanced HeroQuest is not HeroQuest. It came out in the same year. I mean, it almost was on the coattails of HeroQuest. But if you look at who made it, who the authors of it are, who created this system, and kind of where canon can diverge, it is not the same game. It's not a continuation based on the merit of HeroQuest existing. It's a continuation based on the merit of Advanced HeroQuest existing. So it's someone coming along and saying, I own everything that you've ever done, and your adventures now take place in my world. And no matter that this someone may be somebody who with whom you collaborated with to create a world and characters to begin with, A world and characters, by the way, which were either entirely vague or unexplained, or are canonically different every single time you play the game, or canonically entirely different if your heroes die. What do I mean? Well, my barbarian that I play that finishes the trial is not the same as your barbarian that finishes the trial. My barbarian's name is Grimax. Is your barbarian's name Grimax? No? Then they're not the same barbarian. Canonically, we have a branch, we have a fork, and retcons happen all the time. It's why so many of us nerds get so angry. There's so many of us angry video game nerds, angry board game nerds, and especially angry movie and comic book nerds. That was kind of my take before I even got into any of the discussion here in the forums. And I haven't contributed to this discussion because there's just no need for it. But to me, HeroQuest is simply not Warhammer. The idea of the contemporary HeroQuest absolutely, obviously is not. It is its own thing. It's its own interpretation. And there's not really a desire, I feel, even from people who do consider HeroQuest and Warhammer to be one and the same, to even cross that line and say, yeah, that's also in Warhammer, because I feel like it's pretty much unanimously agreed that the 2021 Avalon Hill HeroQuest has got nothing to do with it. It's been reskinned appropriately to get out of it. Now, that's fine, and that's not really what the question is. So let's backpedal now that we've just made that simple clarification and talk about the classic HeroQuest. Hispazargon, I say I halfway agree with him because the game system, let's go back down to Hispazargon's. Let's actually start with his top statement. All European releases of Classic HeroQuest and Advanced HeroQuest are part of the 80s world of Warhammer. I understand the need to share sculpts. I understand the need to share aesthetic because it's Citadel. First of all, it would be like asking a dog to meow to ask Citadel, with whom you have an existing relationship and contracts, to design miniatures that don't look like Citadel miniatures. To say, yeah, you made trolls, just make some more trolls. We need more trolls. But you can make them as similarly as you. You're comfortable drawing trolls, right? That troll that you made, just make the same troll. Why do I keep saying troll? I mean ogre. There are no trolls. There's a single troll in just the HeroQuest magazine. We don't have trolls anywhere else. Troll this, troll that. Ogre. You make ogres, right? The large ogres with the huge bellies and the large heads, and they're stumpy and very strong and stout. Yeah, okay, we need more of those. We need sculpts of those ogres for our game system. Does it mean that they are the same ogres? Does it mean that they are ogres that exist in the other world? I mean, they have mohawks, so I mean, I guess that means something. But again, it's the same designer. It's the same team responsible for the aesthetics. Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you just have the exact same designs? I don't believe that American game system HeroQuest has anything to do with Warhammer. I don't believe that at all. Because I do understand his point, though. I'm not going to say that his point's invalid. It is a valid point. I do understand it. I can't say that I don't understand it. Hispazargon is saying the American classic game system is basically the same story and character from the European similar boxes, but the European box doesn't reference Warhammer. It doesn't reference anything about it other than the familiar monsters, which, in my opinion, it's not talking about the lore of them. It's not talking about origin. It's just vaguely dropping them into the world. So I don't think that necessarily has to be a reference to any specific point of Warhammer fantasy. I'm absolutely cognizant of the fact that Famir are in Warhammer and not in anywhere else. But that doesn't matter to me. To me, it's simply adjacent. It is simply, we had these monsters because we had the license to use them. And, maybe you'll think that they're cool and you'll want more of them later. I don't think that that was the Milton Bradley way of thinking. I think that was the Games Workshop way of thinking. I don't think that was the writers of the quests in the game systems way of thinking. I think that was just the, again, Games Workshop side, the people who were responsible for pushing the plastic onto young consumers, just in their wheelhouse. So I don't consider the American classic game system part of the Warhammer universe at all, even though there is a European equivalent that could be considered part of it. And to be completely honest with you, I'm not part of the EU. So I feel like I'm going to cross a line by saying this. I don't think the EU edition of HeroQuest is part of the Warhammer world either. So there. Now, that's the game system. Talking about Advanced HeroQuest, that's part of World of Warhammer. That's World of Warcraft Hammer. That's explicit. It is stated in the book. But the reason that that doesn't matter to me is because of what Bareheaded Warrior said. And it's very prominent that Advanced HeroQuest is not HeroQuest. It is the product of someone who has come along to take the property, shoehorn it into a completely different system, and use the fact that you can retroactively use it with a couple of other things, if you have those things already, to continue your game. Although if you do continue your game, you're going to be continuing a game that you were playing in a completely different way. So while the references are there, and while there's bits in the rulebook that like firmly establish their take on the lore, it doesn't have authority. Now, I can hear you guys typing now. I hear the keyboards getting pulled out. I hear the knuckles cracking. It does have authority because it's Games Workshop. Right. So let me just illustrate one hypothetical example, and then I'll give you a real example of why this just doesn't have any authority to me. You and I get together. We sit down, and we say, let's make a story together. Let's just make a very simple fantasy story. And through our collaborative efforts, you and I write about a boy who gets lost in the forest. He gets chased down by a werewolf. He gets saved by a goblin. Why am I obsessed with goblins? Who earns the boy's respect, and he is raised by goblins. Does that make any sense? It doesn't have to. Now the boy grows into a warrior who knows all of the goblins' tricks. These are tricks that, he's earned their trust, they've earned his, and he's part of the goblin family, more or less. And other people, other humans, they don't know the goblin's tricks, so they don't know how to do the amazing things that he does in combat and in daily life. So he goes out and he decides, a werewolf killed my family. That it's escalated fast. I'm going to get revenge by hunting all werewolves. I am a werewolf hunter, and I have the skills of a goblinoid, but I am human-sized, and I have human muscles. So I can put those skills into a new context and be very strong. And so we write a quest together wherein the boy has got, 3, 4, 18 scenarios where this young man now is striking at the hearts of werewolves everywhere, invading werewolf cities, attacking werewolf capitals. This is more and more ridiculous. Bear with me. Just bear with me, okay? It sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? Would you buy this game if I made it? So we're good now. We've made this thing. We published it. We're selling it. We're done. You and I go our separate ways. You, who have the rights to the art and the license to use the property, you say, I have this other idea. I have an idea about giant mechs. Giant mechs, just huge robots who can storm the fields, and they're engaged in a war on another planet with these other mechs, and they're fighting for control of the planet. I know. I'm going to use that story about the goblin boy who grew up to hunt werewolves and make that a continuation. It's a completely different setting. There's completely different characters, and I don't have the the inclination to use any of the physical elements of the original story or game. But I'll put a part in my book where it says, hey, if you have that game, you'll be able to play the entire game in this system. You won't be playing it the same way. It won't be the same game at all. But this is now canon because I say so. I'm sorry. That makes no sense to me. Sure, you have every right to do that. It's in your legal power, and people can be a fan of that thing, the mech battle on another planet, and people can absolutely enjoy it, and people can say, the story of my boy who grew up to fight werewolves and then was warped to the moon where he engaged on a massive planetary war wherein mechs were firing lasers and missiles at each other. It's canon. And you know what? That makes sense because you're the enjoyer, you're the player, you're the consumer. You get to decide that. There's not a game company anywhere, anyhow, who can tell you that you can't. There's just nobody with any authority whatsoever that can tell you that you can't. You can say that your barbarian is from the DC Comics universe. You can use Conan the Barbarian, canon, as your character. And you can refuse to play with anybody else who wouldn't accept that as the official adventuring party. And that, my friend, I support that. That makes sense to me. I mean, it's better if they enjoy that and that you do have people to play with, but you have that power. Somebody coming along and telling you, nah, that was retconned. We had a guy go back in time in our storylines and destroy Conan, and he never existed. Now that's the new canon. Guess what? That is a fork, and it happens all the time. We're going to look at some actual examples of these forks that I keep bringing up. Rogue One, a Star Wars story. This is just to get all of you Star Wars fans nice and riled up. That always makes for a good time. I'm kidding. I have no real personal stake in any which way this goes. I'm just giving you observations, and I'm giving you my personal take because it was kind of asked for. But other than that, Rogue One, a Star Wars story. I haven't seen this movie. It's one of the few Star Wars things that I would actually really like to see that I haven't seen yet. Rogue One retcons the idea. Spoiler alert. Okay. We all kind of know how this ends, but we don't know why it ends the way that it does. This movie retcons the idea that the Death Star had that silly flaw wherein Luke was able to fire a couple of photon torpedoes into this ventilation chamber and blow up the entire ship and the tens of thousands of people on it. That was the premise for how they were able to win that battle. That was the conclusion of the first Star Wars movie ever. That was the epic finale to that cinematic experience. Rogue One goes back and says, okay, but the reason that Luke was able to do that is because our character here pre-planned the whole thing. Now, was this an official movie? Yes. Disney expanded the Star Wars universe. Tell me this. It's canon, right? Who am I to tell you it's not canon? I can't. Nobody can. But you can't tell everybody that it is canon if they believe it's not. This is an interpretation. This is something that happened after. This is a different set of writers. This is a different interpretation of the property. This is a different take, a different perspective. This is somebody who wanted to write a story and give you some perspective on the lives of people within it. And they chose to do so and give it real weight and relevance to the original movie by tying it into a climactic event that happened in the first movie. Does that make it canon? Is this something that George Lucas would have conceived of when he wrote the first film? No, because George Lucas wrote what happened at the end of the first film. He completed that story. He said, that's it. There was a fatal flaw in the design plans, and that's the end of it. Now, again, I haven't seen this, so I may be glossing over some extremely important points. But this movie's take on the canon doesn't necessarily have an authority. It's simply here. It's almost like a fan fiction that was simply approved by the studio that owns the rights. And to a lot of people, that is good enough. And that's fine. We can accept that. But to some, it's not good enough. And that too is fine. And I'm sorry, we can accept that too. I want to point to a comic book now. One of my favorite examples of a comic book. It's certainly not the best example. It's just my favorite because I was personally kind of really thrown off and turned off by this. There was a story in the Batman comics called War Games, an arc. And again, spoilers if you haven't seen it, just a minor spoiler. The character known as Spoiler, that's her name. Okay, that was unintentional. I did not intend for that to happen. The character known as Spoiler, Stephanie Brown, she dies at the end of this arc. You can collect the trade paperback that encompasses all of the Batman universe titles and puts them all into one thing. My favorite thing about this, and the reason I love the story so much, is definitely because there are just so many damn people in it. But I really love that the entire Bat family is out there fighting. Like, just months of fighting, in between books. But my favorite part has got to be Cassandra Cain, Batwoman. She does nothing but kick butt the entire time. She does nothing but fight. She does not rest. I don't think she breathes. She just fights. She does nothing but take down person after person after person, and she's very efficient at it. I don't know what it is, but I like that. And they only gave that really to her. I mean, everybody else was kicking butt too, but every time you saw her, she was taking out person after person, not tired, ready, focused on the mission. Who's next? Go to the next place. Soldier right there. MVP. But Spoiler dies at the end of all this. She sustains wounds. And Leslie Tompkins, the doctor of the Batman universe, she tells Batman, yeah, she died from wounds in her hospital bed. You suck for letting it happen. Get better. And so that's the end of War Games. So what happens? What happens? The same thing that happens all the time in comic books. Somebody else comes along and says, no, hold on. Different writer, still got published through DC. Different writer says, Stephanie Brown, let's bring her back. She's actually going to be a Batgirl. We're just going to go ahead and retcon that. And the reason that we're going to do that is so we can, it's dramatic. We get to bring back this character. She's alive again. I don't even know that there was a deeper purpose. I think people just maybe thought that if they canvassed the crowd opinion that, hey, Stephanie Brown wasn't used enough. She was Robin for a short while, and she was fired for disobeying. And we're going to give her another chance. We like this character. I mean, they did the same thing with Jason Todd. They had a freaking phone line that you could call to vote on whether or not to let Robin die when Jason Todd was killed way back. And people called these numbers, and the people really want Robin to die for some reason. They wanted that drama. You didn't see that drama very often, not to that deepness, not to that extent in Batman comics back then. But people were like, yeah, kill Robin. So they did. They killed Jason Todd. Joker had done him off. I don't think that that's the correct terminology at all. Done him in. Wow. And so no more Jason Todd. Jason Todd never appeared ever again for the rest of comics and DC universe history. Well, until he did. Jason Todd has been long time established as the Red Hood. And he has just been a powerhouse character in a lot of different interpretations, a lot of different comics. I think he's even like with Starfire. I'm not sure. There's kind of an interpretation of the Teen Titans where it's him and Starfire and one of the Speedy, I think. That's a pretty good comic. I've only read one issue, and I read it a few years ago, but it was a pretty good comic. But anyways, it happens all the time. People write things that conflict with earlier things, and these branches are not always respected in and of themselves. A writer who worked on a previous work might come back and retcon the thing that was retconning their original work. And so once you see that happen, once you see that somebody can retcon a thing that was retconning someone else's work, you begin to understand that you, as the reader, as the enjoyer, can actually kind of pick and choose what makes the most sense to you. Because these universes no longer agree with one another. There's no point to any of the universes unless you choose the path that makes the most sense to you. And you're willing, in some cases, to overlook minor details that weren't considered when people were writing about this stuff and trying to maintain a cohesive storyline. I'm not even going to get into X-Men. We're going to stop at Batman. And personally, for me, Grant Morrison never touched Batman. Batman never traveled through time as Bruce Wayne to get back to the present. For me, Dick Grayson may as well never even put on the cape and cowl to be Batman. I just don't care. That storyline was so fun. There was a lot of entertaining moments with Batman and Robin, where Dick Grayson was Batman and Damian Wayne was Robin. But I don't need for that to have been official canon. If I was rewriting the whole thing front to back and I was in charge of a great storyline full of books that was supposed to be the origin of Batman to the end, I wouldn't include that anywhere because it just doesn't make sense to be canon. It's a lot of fun, but it just doesn't have to be set in that universe. Or rather, it is set in the universe, but it doesn't have to be an official part of it. And that, my friends, brings me back full circle to Advanced HeroQuest not having any agency over the HeroQuest setting. It just doesn't. And so for those of you who think that HeroQuest is set in the Warhammer world, you're right. And for those of you who think that it's not, you're also right. Because you can kind of pick and choose what you would like to see, how you would like this interpreted. Not because you are Zargon, and not because you are an enjoyer, but because the signs that are there are too vague to make it concrete one way or another. I'm sorry, they're too ambiguous. And so officially, I would not accept that it is an absolute yes. And officially, I would also not accept that it's an absolute no. Personally, my personal take, as somebody looking at the signs and wanting to kind of create a universe that's maintaining the HeroQuest look and feel accurately, it's not Warhammer, it's HeroQuest. And to me, that statement makes sense. I know it's not going to make sense to every single person out there, and I'm okay with that. You're absolutely free to disagree. Put your stuff in the comments below. I love the well-worded, huge, long walls of text takes on things. I love that people can spend that amount of time and dedication to write their thoughts out. And I love reading that stuff. And I promise you, I read every single comment that comes my way. And if I have time, I respond as well. But I love the Dave Morris take, and I would just love for people to consider that the writer of this world, or at least the novels, who was involved with our seminal game, the game of all time. I guess that's HeroScape, actually. I can't use that phrase. Whatever. The best board game of all time. They were not particularly attached to the HeroQuest world. I will say Zargon is right on his interpretation that the European HeroQuest expansions, absolutely part of the 80s world of Warhammer, the interpretation, because of the old world, or the known world map in the back of the book. But going right back to what Bareheaded Warrior said, it's Bareheaded Warrior. There's no relevance to that because that's not in the game system. And the literal only thing that would tie this in with that map, the actual content itself with the map, is there's a name of a quest that talks about one of the locations on that map, and there is reference to that location. And I mean, it's fine and all, but it's not really much different than, say, Deadpool in the Deadpool movie, seeing a picture of Hugh Jackman and making jokes about him being Hugh Jackman and Wolverine, or making jokes about Green Lantern, it's an adjacency that makes sense because of inference and reference, but it's not a handshake connection. That's just my opinion. Everything else here, still valid takes. I'm not saying anybody's wrong. I'm just saying, I don't have the authority to say anybody's wrong, and nobody out there has the authority to tell anybody else that they're wrong. They're just good takes. And there's some other takes that are they're good, but there's no authority behind them. Anyway, guys, I hope that wasn't too spicy of a topic for this BWODECAST. I want to thank Seek Hashem once more for bringing the poll here to my attention and requesting the video. It was actually a lot of fun to deep dive into it. I had an excuse to talk about Batman. I'll always take that if I can. It'll be a rarity on a channel devoted to board games. Although I do have Batman, Talisman Batman Edition. We'll be taking a look at that fairly soon. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Comment anything you like down below, and I will see you in the next video. Until then, have a great rest of your day, and bye for now.